Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. Today's episode, we're going to walk through the day as it pertains to the 16th of June, 1976. It's not an easy story to tell or hear, but it is our story, and it is one of those major global events that changed the world. It is very important for me to say that I will be peppering in pictures that will be hard to look at. And if you are triggered by those, then maybe just listen to my voice or skip this week. I am so enjoying telling our stories, but days like these are hard because these were children. The account for how this was put together is based on court documents, journalists' accounts, later interviews with participants, and TRC interviews or testimonies. It's really a chiseled together timeline of what happened that day. On the morning of Wednesday, the 16th of June, 1976, thousands of children across Soweto did something the apartheid state never expected. They stopped listening. Desmond Tutu, Anglican Archbishop and anti-apartheid leader, said, "When people decide they want to be free, there is nothing that can stop them." They left their classrooms, formed ranks in the street, and marched, not as criminals, not as soldiers, but as students. They carried no weapons. They carried no political party banners. They carried school bags, notebooks, and handwritten placards. By the end of the day, children would lie dead in the streets. Photographs would travel the world, and apartheid would lose something it never recovered: the illusion that it could rule forever without challenge. It's the story of the day the classrooms rose, and a generation changed the course of South African history. At 6 a.m., it was a morning like any other. Dawn broke cold over Soweto. Winter sunlight spread thinly across Orlando West. Kerosene stove hissed. Mothers packed lunches, school uniforms, some neatly pressed, others wore thin, were pulled from hooks behind doors. Students moved quietly. Some carried books, some carried placards hidden between exercise pads. A few had slept badly. Tsetsi Mashinini, 19 years old, rose knowing the day would test something larger than a language policy. Later in exile, he would recall, "We had planned it carefully. We wanted it peaceful." Across Soweto School, Morris Isaacson, Orlando West Junior Secondary, Naledi High, Mfini, Word had already travelled. Today they would not attend class. At Morris Isaacson High School, students assembled in the yard. There was nervous laughter, excitement, fear. Student marshals, appointed in advance, moved through the crowd, urging discipline. They set rules. No stones, no provocation, no vandalism. Peaceful march. Murphy Marobe would later testify before the TRC. "We emphasize that it must be peaceful. There must be no destruction." Mashinini said, "We were not prepared to accept an education that was meant to keep us inferior." He later reflected, "We expected confrontation. We did not expect live ammunition." The plan was simple: converge from multiple schools and march towards Orlando Stadium. They carried signs reading, "Down with Afrikaans, we want equal education." Teachers tried to stop them. Some pleaded, some warned, some quietly stepped aside. The protest was aimed at the Afrikaans medium decree, which the government issued as a directive in 1974. As mentioned before, it ordered that Afrikaans be used as a compulsory medium of instruction for key complex subjects such as mathematics, science, and geography in black secondary schools. To the state, this was administrative. To black students, it was an insult layered upon an injustice. Students had reached a breaking point. We were instructed no negotiation, Afrikaans or disciplinary action. Students responded collectively. One recalled, "We were not against Afrikaans. We were against being forced." The decree was not only impractical. As I mentioned, many teachers did not speak Afrikaans fluently. It was symbolic. It reminded students that even their minds were not their own. And beneath the decree lay something deeper, the accumulated humiliation of Bantu education. By 8 a.m., the march had expanded. Students poured out of the school gates. As they moved through Soweto's streets, others joined. Young children, curious residents, passerbys. An eyewitness testimony said, "There were thousands. It felt powerful, but peaceful. They sang freedom songs, Nkosi Sikelele, struggle chants. They carried homemade placards. They raised their fists, and they believed that they were being heard." The march swelled into thousands. Journalist Peter Makubane, who would photograph that day, later recalled, "They were disciplined. They were not running wild." Students assembled in Orlando West. By mid-morning, between 10,000 and 20,000 students were marching through Soweto. Police began positioning themselves ahead of the columns. They had been alerted. The state had prepared for unrest. What it had not prepared for was scale. Authorities had underestimated turnout. What they saw instead was a river of uniformed children. By 9 a.m. near Orlando West Junior Secondary School, police vehicles blocked the route. Officers stood with rifles. Students stopped. Accounts vary slightly on exact sequencing, but multiple witnesses agree on what happened next. The police ordered dispersal. Students slowed but continued approaching. Leaders attempted to negotiate passage. Witnesses later describe shouting, confusion, and rising tension. Students sang louder. Brigadier Jan Prinsloo later testified at the Sali Commission of Inquiry. "We ordered them to disperse. They refused." Some students claimed a police dog was released into the crowd. Now, if you understand many things about South Africa, and South Africa at that point was that police dogs were used a lot against people to disperse them, to get to them, and which made a lot of people fearful of dogs. So that was a big act of aggression against those children. Rifles are visible on the police. The students sit or stand. They're uncertain what will happen next. Some continue singing, others shout slogans. The marshals attempt to keep the crowd calm. The gap between expectation and reality widens. Tensions thickened. Without resolving the standoff, police fire tear gas into the crowd. Panic ripples outward. Students scatter, coughing and blinded. Some throw stones in response, not as planned, but as instinctive reaction to the tear gas. Police release more dogs into the crowd. Chaos replaces discipline. Then came the sound that would fracture history: gunfire. The police opened fire with live ammunition. At first, many students believed they were warning shots. Then people began falling. Screams replaced songs. Children ran in all directions. The protests had become a battlefield. Children ran, children fall. Multiple accounts indicate that Hastings and Lovo was among the first shot. A witness later said, "He fell suddenly. We thought it was rubber bullets. Then we saw blood." Moments later, Hector Pieterson was fatally wounded, a 12-year-old boy. He was carried by Mbuiso Makubo, while Hector's sister, Antoinette Sitole, ran beside them. A student recalled, "When Hector fell, we knew something irreversible had happened." The photographer Sam Nzima captured the image that would circle the world. Hector's limp body, carried by a student, Mbuyisa Makubo, his sister Antoinette Satole, running beside them. Nzima later described the moment. There was a volley of shots. The children started running. I saw Hector fall. Antoinette Satole, speaking decades later, remembered, I heard the gunshots. I saw my brother fall. The photograph was published internationally the next day. Inside South Africa, censorship attempted to contain the narrative. It failed. The shooting, by 11 a.m., everything erupted. The shooting did not end the protest, which I think they really thought it would. It just transformed it from a protest to an uprising. Anger spread rapidly, replacing fear. Students scattered and regrouped. Residents joined them. Police pursued fleeing students. Armored vehicles entered residential streets. Barricades are erected using debris and burning tires. Shops close. Public transport halts. The uprising is no longer only about students. It has become a community revolt. Government buildings were targeted. Administrative offices burned. Vehicles overturned. The uprising was no longer a march. Journalist Alistair Sparks later wrote, it was if a lid had blown off. Police reinforcements flooded the township. Live ammunition continued. By noon, confrontation spread beyond Orlando West, Naledi, Dube, Meadowlands. Tear gas mixed with winter air. Students armed themselves with stones and police responded with rifles. A doctor who treated the victims that day later told the TRC they were children with bullet wounds. The official death toll initially reported 23. Later investigations placed it far higher. The TRC ultimately cited at least 176 deaths in the broader uprising period, though some researchers argue that the number exceeded 500. By 1 p.m., the state has lost control of the situation. Hospitals are overwhelmed. Medical staff work without pause. Many injured they fear seeking treatment. They're worried about arrest. Bodies begin accumulating in the morgue. Journalists begin reporting the scale of violence. Images of dead and wounded children circulate internationally. Global outrage builds rapidly. For the apartheid government, the narrative of order is collapsing. Fighting continues as daylight fades. Smoke hangs over the township. Sirens echo constantly. Schools emptied. Factories release workers early as unrest spread. Parents search for children. Mothers ran towards gunfire, searching for their kids. Families search the streets and hospitals for missing children. Many will not be found that night. Winnie Madikizela Mandela appeared publicly in the aftermath. She said later, the blood of our children must not be in vain. Helicopters circled overhead. Police stations fortified. Murphy Marobe later reflected, after the first shots, it was no longer under anyone's control. The original organizers who had insisted on peaceful discipline now found themselves inside something irreversible. The state had escalated first and legitimacy shifted. So we're at 3 p.m. now. The smoke columns rose across Soweto. Beer halls, symbols of municipal controlled, burned. Administrative buildings were attacked. Police responded with heavier force, as they always do. A journalist, Ranjini Munusamy, later observed, June 16 shattered the myth of docile black youth. As dusk approached, parents located injured children in clinics and hospitals. Some families learned their children would never return home. Antoinette Satole later reflected, that day changed everything. The government framed the events as riot and disorder, but something fundamental had shifted. The youth had confronted the state openly, and the world had seen it. Night fell over a township altered permanently. Police impose heavy patrols. Curfews are enforced informally. Gunfire continues intermittently. Soweto does not sleep. Inside homes, radios broadcast fragmented news. Parents hold surviving children close. Others sit in silence, waiting for someone who will never return. The scale of tragedy is still not fully understood. By midnight, Soweto is scarred, grieving and furious. Arrests began. Funerals would follow. Protests would spread nationally to Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, and Durban. Within months, thousands of students would flee into exile, joining armed wings of liberation movements. The apartheid state would never fully regain psychological control over black youth again. Archbishop Desmond Tutu later said, "The children lit a match that no one could extinguish." June the 16th marked the beginning of apartheid's irreversible unraveling. The children had marched for language. They ignited a revolution. The uprising would continue for months. Hundreds would die. Thousands would be detained. Many leaders will flee into exile. The myth of passive acceptance is gone. Young people have exposed the true costs of apartheid to the world. The apartheid government described the uprising as criminal. It blamed agitators, communists, foreign influences. Evil villain number 2, Prime Minister John Vorster, defended police action, said the police were compelled to act against unarmed students holding placards. Sure, John, sure. The Afrikaans decree was not withdrawn. Apartheid was no longer a policy debate, it was a moral crisis. Of those thousands that were arrested in the weeks that followed, former detainees testified. We were beaten, interrogated, and told we were terrorists. Young women reported gendered humiliation and threats. The uprising entered police vans, interrogation rooms, and courtrooms. And what happened and what followed was legal enforcement, because the apartheid government did not need to suspend the law or create new ones to detain these individuals. It had already written the law it required. They relied heavily on the Terrorism Act of 1967, especially Section 6, the Internal Security Act, and the Suppression of Communism Act. Now, Section 6 of the Terrorism Act allowed indefinite detention for interrogation. So no charge, no time limit, and no judicial review. The detainees would be held until the commissioner was satisfied or is satisfied. That phrase carried extraordinary power. A former human rights attorney later observed, the law was precise. It was simply designed to protect the state, not the citizen. This was legality weaponized. Of those thousands that were detained post-June 1976, many of them were under 18. They were taken to facilities like John Foster Square in Johannesburg. Former detainees describe solitary confinement, bright lights left on continuously, sleep deprivation, and repeated interrogation sessions. One former student recalled, they kept asking us who the leaders were, and we kept saying we all were. Parents were often not informed of their children's whereabouts. Surprises me, none. Access to lawyers were delayed or denied, and detention without trial became the state's primary tool. When detainees appeared in court, proceedings were tightly managed. Remand hearings were brief. Police affidavits were rarely challenged successfully, not surprising. Magistrates generally deferred to national security. Bail was routinely denied. A defense lawyer later stated, "You walked into court knowing the outcome before the session began." The courtroom became procedural theater. The appearance of justice replaced justice itself. Some activists faced formal prosecution. Among those detained was Murphy Marobe. Charges commonly included public violence, incitement, and furthering the aims of banned organizations. Even though, let's not forget, these kids were not carrying political party banners. They were just protesting against this Afrikaans decree, against the government, for themselves. Evidence frequently relied on police testimony, which we can absolutely rely on. Yeah. Confessions extracted under duress, and broad interpretation of subversion. Without a constitutional Bill of Rights, courts upheld the security legislation. Legal arguments about due process had limited traction. The judiciary interpreted its role narrowly, which it had for years now. Despite the constraint, resistance emerged within legal practice. Human rights lawyers documented torture allegations. Families organized defense funds. Court transcripts preserved testimonies that would later reappear during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South African hearings. Law did not stop repression, but it recorded it, and records matter. It spread across the country for months, then years. But for the young people involved, life never returned to normal. Many students could not go back to school. Their names were on police lists. They were blacklisters, essentially. Their schools were militarized. Their teachers were watched. Some went into hiding. Some were detained repeatedly, and some fled the country. Childhood ended abruptly, not symbolically, but practically. Many young activists reached adulthood without formal education because they couldn't return to school. So, no formal education, no qualification, no safety net. They were celebrated as heroes in speeches, but in everyday life, survival was far more complicated. For those who fled South Africa, exile became a defining experience. Teenagers crossed borders into Botswana, Lesotho, Mozambique, Zambia, Angola, and Tanzania. Some joined the armed wing of the liberation movement. Some received political education. Some lived in refugee camps. Life in exile was disciplined, dangerous, and uncertain. Many lost friends to illness, accidents, or military attacks. Some were buried far from home without family present. We've spoken about this in the past, the impact of exile on the person in exile. They feel lonely. They feel disconnected from their home. When democracy finally came, many exiles returned to the country they no longer recognize. Parents had aged or died. Siblings had grown up without them, and communities had changed. Some returnees were welcomed as veterans. Others were met with indifference. The country had moved on. So, after Soweto, these minors were detained under the same legislation as adults. Juvenile protections were bypassed. A mother later testified, "They treated my son like a trained insurgent. He was 16 and still doing homework." The language of the law transformed the students into enemies of the state. Child became suspect, student became insurgent. Legal categories blurred under political pressure. The detention strategies tested in 1976 foreshadowed the 1980s state of emergency. Mass arrests, media restrictions, banning orders. Soweto was a rehearsal. What began as targeted detention evolved into systemic mass repression. Detention had long-term effects. Former child detainees described long-term effects: nightmares, anxiety, difficulty trusting authority, interrupted schooling, and struggles with employment. Many never spoke publicly about what they endured. Shame and fear lingered long after the cells were left behind. Some carried survivor's guilt, the question that haunted many former activists: why did I live when others died? Families bore economic strain. Communities learned to navigate surveillance. The law did not only incarcerate bodies, it reshaped social relationships. Trauma did not disappear with freedom. it waited. In the democratic era, South Africa's constitution enshrined protection against arbitrary detention, the right to legal counsel, and judicial oversight. They were deliberate reversals of post-1976 practices. The memory of detention without trial shaped constitutional design. In the mid-1990s, South Africa created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I've mentioned a couple of times now. For the first time, victims of apartheid violence were invited to speak publicly. Among them were former youth activists. Some were nervous, some were angry, some struggled to finish sentences. One of the most recognizable voices belonged to Antoinette Satole, the sister of Hector Pieterson. She spoke not as a symbol, but as a sister who had watched her brother die. Other testimonials follow. Former students spoke of beatings, humiliation, sexual abuse, and isolation. Parents spoke of children who never came home. The commission revealed a painful truth. Apartheid did not only kill bodies, it damaged minds, families, and futures. For many years, women's roles in the youth uprising were overlooked. Girls were described as helpers, not leaders. But history had corrected itself. Researchers, activists, and survivors have documented the central role girls played as organizers, as messengers, as medics, as political thinkers, as fighters in exile. The experiences of detention and trauma have reshaped how South Africa understands political violence. The struggle did not have one face, it had many. The children of 1976 left behind more than history. They left behind a tradition of youth activism, for student movements in the 1980s to campaigns like Fees Must Fall decades later. Young people in South Africa have continued to challenge injustice. The lesson of June 16 remained clear. Young people are not passive recipients of history. They are its makers. But the story of the lost boys and girls also carry a warning. Liberation without support leaves wounds untreated. Memory without material justice feels hollow. South Africa owes the youth of 1976 more than ceremonies. It owes them recognition, support, mental health care, education inclusion, and a future worthy of their sacrifice. A nation that forgets the cost of its freedom risks repeating its mistakes. The children who marched on June the 16th, 1976 did not know that they were changing history. They only knew that what they were given was not enough. They wanted dignity, they wanted education, and they wanted a future. Some lived to see freedom, some did not. Some returned home broken, some never returned home at all. But together they shifted the course of a nation. Next, we'll look at that photograph that changed the world. We'll speak about the actual after effects, some more of the after effects of 1976 before we get on to the big one. Thank you so much for joining this week. It was a hard one. But like I said, if we forget what was sacrificed to get us to the freedom we have today, we are doomed to repeat it. And I'm not saying South Africa is A-okay and we're doing amazing and things are fucking hunky-dory. I'm not saying that. I am saying that the freedom we have today needs to be recognized of the sacrifices that these people, these children, these parents made that day. Whether your child passed, whether your child couldn't go back to school and get an education and was stuck as a result, or whether your child went to exile and became disconnected from their people. It was a massive sacrifice. And all they wanted to do was be heard. And all that was done was they were persecuted. Never forget. Not to build hatred, but don't think you're allowed to forget something so pivotal that changed us as a nation. To remember these people who sacrificed their lives one way or another to get us as a nation, being able to be free, being able to be free to protest, being able to be free to have our voices heard. Today, it seems like all for the cause, but for those individuals, it wasn't. And you are not allowed to forget that. It is precious. And as we see regimes springing up all over the world in places that people didn't expect, people that called us a specific kind of country at some stage, you realize how important it is and how impactful it is when people start losing their freedom of speech and their ability to protest peacefully. Slots in 100% to what we are seeing. The one thing I will say, I don't think there's enough uproar, condemnation for the killing of children across war-torn countries today. It is a travesty that we've become numb and desensitized to knowing that children are dying in countries where they really shouldn't be. As our kids past were killed on this day of June the 16th, 1976, as the indignation, uproar, and the blasting of the government that allowed this to happen from all over the globe should be happening with what is happening across the world today. Should not be what it is now. Okay. Thank you so much. Keep interacting. Please, please, please. I think like 90% of you are watching the videos but not subscribing or not following where you are interacting with this content. So please, 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 if I ask you one thing today, is to subscribe and like this video and continue to interact, comment on the content wherever you find it. I really, really appreciate it. Okay, go well, and I'll see you next week. Bye.